I will be right back.
Madelyn, can you hear me?
I can. I was muted for a moment.
Okay, listen, I meant to send you another email today. The only other groups that, the only other group which is might have a comment is Circle City Greens.
Yeah, I sent you that.
Oh, you sent me that. Okay, well, that's
Yeah.
good. Okay, and then
Yeah, I don't, oh, I need to have that list in front of me too, right?
that would be a good thing to have.
I'm not going to read them off at any
Oh,
point,
no.
but I'm just going to ask for comments.
Yeah,
So-
ask for questions, ask for people to put their questions and comments in the chat.
Yeah, you know that,
Saying
No.
what group they're with.
not in the chat, the chat's closed.
The Q&A. I mean, they put it in
Yeah.
the Q&A and say, I'm with Circle City Greens and I want to say that, you know,
Okay,
I'm with this group.
okay. Yeah, so
and
let
then-
me get this one other thing up there. Hurry, 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 time isn't wasting. We're gonna start exactly on time or give people a little time to get to arrive.
Maybe Bob should answer that. I don't know if he could hear us. He's admitting people, I believe.
Yeah.
People are in the room now listening to us. We will actually launch the webinar probably a minute after, a minute or two.
Okay.
Please welcome Madeleine Hoffman.
Okay, good evening, everyone. My name is Madeleine Hoffman. I'm a co-chair of the Green Party US Peace Action Committee, otherwise known as GPACS. And I am excited about tonight's program. I would like to welcome you all to our program on Ukraine, fossil fuels, and unanswered questions. We have a packed lineup of people to speak to you tonight. I'm going to just give you a very quick description of what this, what we will be discussing, and then turn it over to our speakers to continue. No other issue at this point in time, maybe with the exception of the leaked memo on abortion that came out yesterday. There's no other issue that's been taking up as much time and space in our on our TV screens and in our newspapers and online than the situation in Ukraine. And we thought it would be important for a coalition of groups to have a webinar on describing what the Ukraine war can tell us about the challenges of humanity's urgent need to reduce fossil fuel usage. How does this war reflect colonialism and racism? How well is President Zelenskyy coping with opposition political parties and the Azov Battalion? We want to know a little bit. It's really important because our media doesn't really give us much of the history and context of what prompted or precipitated this conflict and war. We want to talk a little bit about Joe Biden's role in this history. He's no newcomer to the scene in Ukraine. And then also what NATO has done, and as well also how the media affects our perceptions of the war. And what's key? What do we need to do to bring peace to Ukraine? There's so many questions swirling. Even the Pope weighed in on it today, talking about the fact that perhaps NATO's actions actually precipitated Putin's actions. So let's get started. We'll invite you all to post comments and questions, but only in the Q&A section. Here, the chat has been disabled, so you might find yourself typing and trying to get something through and it won't go through. Don't worry, that's deliberate. It's not a problem. Put your questions, please, on your comments in the Q&A section. And if you could, if you are a sponsoring organization, or even if you're not a co-sponsoring organization, if you could put your name, the organization you belong to, and then write your comment. We'll be calling on, we'll be going over those questions and trying and answering as many as we can. But we will be giving preference at the end of this evening to commenters from co-sponsoring organizations. So that's why we need to know if you're a co-sponsoring if you're from a co-sponsoring organization, and if you'd like to make a comment at the end. And I think that's it. I think I need to turn it over to our first speaker, who is Stan Cox with the Land Institute. And Stan will talk to us about fossil fuel reduction and how it relates to this current conflict.
Hi, thank you, Madeleine. You know, the last couple of months have proved once again that climate is an issue in Washington, only so long as there's no military conflict, energy shortage, looming election, natural disaster, or lobbying. by the military industrial complex. Other than that, they're serious about climate. Predictably, as soon as Russia invaded Ukraine, House Minority Leader and Speaker wannabe Kevin McCarthy called for fast-tracking liquid natural gas exports to NATO countries, fully restarting the federal offshore drilling lease program, and immediately approving projects such as the Keystone XL pipeline. But there's bipartisan consensus on fossil fuels. White House spokesperson Jen Psaki urged oil and gas companies to use the 4,000 new drilling permits that the Biden administration has issued for use on federal lands and, quote, go get more supply out of the ground. Later, the administration threatened to fine companies for not drilling and pumping on land where they had been awarded leases. Speaking at a Houston Clean Energy Roundtable a year ago, Jennifer Granholm, the energy secretary, said all the right things about energy and climate. But then in March, with the invasion underway and the boycott of Russian oil in place, she headed back to Houston and urged oil and gas executives to ramp up their production to record output. Also in a March 8th letter to the president, 4 Democratic US House members from Texas pushed for deregulation as just one of several, quote, practical steps to promote long-term American energy production. Now, you'd think that the current disruption of world oil and gas markets would make this as good a time as any to start driving fossil fuel use down to zero on an expedited schedule while ensuring universal, equitable access to affordable energy. But this Congress, which is obviously incapable of passing even the weakest climate legislation, is certainly not going to enact a fossil fuel phase out. That leaves it to Bill McKibben and company to take to the websites and call for a response to the Ukraine war and rising oil and natural gas prices by saying there should be, above all else, an all-out acceleration of the development of America's so-called renewable energy capacity, that somehow is going to teach Russia a lesson and is going to immediately fix the world oil market and so forth. But as we all know, building a whole bunch more solar and wind capacity can't work through the market to drive fossil fuels out of all the places they're used: electricity generation, transportation, manufacturing, agriculture, construction.
About a minute or so left.
Okay. There's no way that's going to happen. So affluent nations like the United States are going to need to phase out our fossil fuels even faster. There's no way to reach that precipitous rate of reduction without pushing fossil fuels out of the economy speedily and directly by law. That would provide the strongest possible incentive for improving energy conservation efficiency, and fuels and probably other resources would have to be reallocated for production of essential goods and services. And to keep energy affordable for consumers through, we would need price controls and fair share rationing to ensure sufficient equitable energy access for all.
Thank you, Stan. We have 10 speakers tonight, so my introductions are going to be very brief to allow maximum time for the actual presentation by each of the speakers. I just want to say that our next speaker will be Barbara Chicherio from the Green Party of St. Louis, and she'll be talking about the history of Ukraine. And this will, in some respect, relate to one of the questions that's in the question and answer section about Ukraine and its right. Does it have a right to self-defense and self-determination? The issue is more complex than that. Barbara?
Yes, thank you for letting me speak this evening. Yes, I am not giving a 5-minute history of the Ukraine. I'm going to give some background of what I found out through reading. So for over 1,000 years, the boundary of what is now called Ukraine have changed repeatedly. And could I have the next slide, Jim? As illustrated in the map you are seeing. Sometimes the dominant power would be Poland, Lithuania, Russia, or Ukraine. Early in the 20th century, Ukraine, like Russia, was controlled by Tsarist oligarchs. 1905 saw the first Russian Revolution, where a new political party emerged, the Revolutionary Ukrainian Party, that forced Tsars to make a number of liberal concessions, including the right for Ukrainians to publish in the Ukrainian language. World War I left Ukraine devastated, killing untold thousands and destroying its infrastructure. 1917, the Russian Revolution breathed new life into the Ukrainian movement. But the next 6 years, Ukraine experienced war and civil war until the early 20s, when the country was divided among a number of states and Crimea became part of the Soviet Union. In 1922, Ukraine and Russia were two of the founding members of the USSR. Ukraine embraced the ideals of the Russian Revolution. And Jim, could you show the next slide, please? The flag you are seeing symbolizes the freedom of thought and expression in Ukraine during the time of Lenin. 1923, Lenin's policies resulted in a blossoming of Ukrainian culture. Ukrainians devised a unique educational system, made great strides in the arts. Ethnic Ukrainians were appointed to political and economic positions, and all languages were accepted and encouraged. 1933, this was a brutal period for Ukraine under Stalin. Food shortages were affecting the entire USSR, with about 4 million people dying. The famine was most intense in Ukraine, where grain and crops were sent out of Ukraine and into Russia to feed industrial workers. Some historians viewed it as Stalin's plan to eliminate the Ukrainian independence movement. Others felt it was simply a combination of drought and poor planning. During this time, there was also a growth in anti-Semitism. 1939, World War II, the Soviets annexed Western Ukraine. Thousands were deported, arrested, and sent to gulags. Diverse publications disappeared. 1941, Germany occupied Ukraine. Violence against Jews increased, with 1.5 million Jews, roughly 1/4 of the Holocaust victims, were killed in Ukraine. Nazi policies towards non-Jews was also harsh, with over 2 million deported to Germany for slave labor. 1949, NATO. NATO was created by the United States, Canada, and several Western European nations. This treaty was formed as a collective effort to provide security against the Soviet Union. Once the Soviet Union ended in 1991, there was really no longer a justification for NATO to exist, but it endures as a military alliance against Russia. And Russia continues to express alarm at NATO's expansion, which allows the US to have nuclear missiles closer to Russia than Soviet missiles were to the US in 1962. Russia declared in 2008 inclusion of Ukraine into NATO would be a red button issue for them. 1956 to 1972, after Stalin's death, there was a resurgence of the Ukrainian cultural movement. 86, Chernobyl. 1990s.
We have about a minute left.
Okay. Let's see. Ukrainian independence, period of extreme inflation. 2005 to 2010, Viktor Yushchenko was president of the Ukraine, and he implemented a program of austerity, reduced social spending, bailed out large banks, deregulated agriculture, advocated for NATO membership, and repressed the rights of language minorities like Russian speakers. 2010, after a contentious runoff election, Viktor Yanukovych, thank you, Barbara. Viktor Yanukovych is democratically elected as president. 2013, Yanukovych is poised to sign a trade agreement with EU, but instead accepts financial aid from Russia. US and Western Europe desperately want investor-friendly policies in Ukraine and viewed signing the EU agreement as being a step towards integrating Ukraine with the EU. In order to be part of this program, EU demanded that Kyiv sell off government assets and give the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, more control over Ukraine's state spending. So in closing, the strong economic imperative for opening foreign markets to large multinational corporations and the drive for NATO expansion against Russia led the US to be deeply involved in the 2014 coup. Thank you.
Well done there. You got us up to 2014 and didn't exceed the 5-minute limit. Was well done. And very important to give us that perspective, because we never, we're never really given the history of Ukraine as part of this, what's happening today. I'm going to introduce Chris Mann now, the Green Party of Kansas City, because Chris Mann is going to talk about fascists and Ukraine's 2014 coup. And this gets to the issue of self-determination, but in a different kind of way, in the wrong kind of way, I think. Go ahead, Chris.
Thank you. Thanks, Barb, for your history before that. My contribution to this discussion involves two areas: describing the coup of 2014 and addressing the rise in fascism. Ukraine is now experiencing a militarized resurgence of Nazism. In 2014, a Ukraine neo-Nazi militia called the Azov Battalion was formed to combat Russian separatism in the Donbass region. It was then incorporated into the National Guard, making it an official part of the Ukrainian military. The Azov Battalion has received military training from both the United States and Canada, along with a group called the Right Sector. The first coup, the Maidan coup of 2014, was a violent and unconstitutional ouster of President Viktor Yanukovych, elected in 2010. But weeks before his ouster, someone leaked a phone call by the Undersecretary of State of the United States, Victoria Nuland, and she appeared to be in a conversation where she was choosing the next president of Ukraine. So the first job of Yatsenyuk, who is the replacement for Yushchenko, for Yanukovych, he made the Ukrainian language the law of the land, even though many Russians speak the Russian language. And he also pressured the Ukrainian Orthodox Church into severing ties with the Patriarch of Moscow. Now, to continue with the fascism aspect, both fascism and imperialism are matched. To achieve fascism, you must call the other side evil. To continue war and imperialism, you must impose unpopular rules on the working class. And if the working class doesn't comply, that's when the intimidation and swift physical and psychological punishment result. Some of my research for this short talk has been through videos from the News Consortium, which is an array of films done during the aftermath of the 2014 coup. They feature the United States president and vice president, which is Biden and Obama, talking and really covering over the actions after that. And also they feature videos of the fighting and the skirmishes, taking over buildings and government centers and so forth. And they also feature interviews with people, some of which I'll mention. So one of these is a document that was produced in 2015. It was called War Crimes of the Armed Forces and Security Forces of Ukraine, the torture of the people in the Donbass region.
Excuse me, Chris, you
Almost-
have about a minute left.
Thank you. Almost, it's pages and pages and pages of torture and harassment of people in the Donbass region. Odessa, there is one video that's extremely important because people in Odessa called for a referendum to not go along with the Ukrainian plan. There was citizens of Odessa were trapped inside a union hall and burned. They were not permitted to come out by a crowd of Nazis. I'd like to just end with some quotes from people who were interviewed in some of these videos. An unarmed group of citizens were talking to a press person from the UK, and a woman asked, when are they going to stop calling us separatists and terrorists? Where does the bitterness and hate come from? What have we done that they hate us so much? Why don't they just leave us alone? And another man steps in, suggesting that the United Kingdom and the United States say we are the terrorists. He says, do I look like a terrorist? He asks the news person, he looks right into the camera, and then another person jumps in and says, my relatives live in Russia. How can two Slavic people go to war? We don't want war, but the government in Kiev gave the order to kill us. So in closing, I think I want to say that for people that want to send more arms, the ordinary people of the working class don't want more arms. They want a life without the wars. And so we have to, that's our job. We have to figure out how to do that with them.
Thank you, Cris. And I love that. I love that final question and challenge you pose to all of us in terms of how to move forward without additional arms being sent into the region, finding ways to negotiate and move through this to a better spot for everyone involved. Our next speaker is Kim Scipes. Did I pronounce that correctly?
It's Scipes.
Scipes. excuse me, from Veterans for Peace. And you are to be speaking about Zelenskyy and the Azov Battalion.
Well, I'm gonna be talking about the issue of fascism. I'm glad that Cris said some things about this. But to put this into a proper context, we have to understand that the U.S. has been fighting against first the Soviet Union and then Russia ever since World War II. When Hitler's armies entered the Ukraine in 1941, they were greeted as liberators by a large number of the population. And so there's been has been a fascist movement that has existed in the Ukraine a long time. Now, before the war was over, the US brought out a lot of Nazi as well as Ukrainian fascists out of Eastern Europe and brought them to the US and trained them. And then the CIA, throughout the Cold War, had been sending military units into the Soviet Union, including sabotage and intelligence operations and things like this. So I think what we have to do is, first of all, we have to understand that the US and the Soviet Union basically were two different empires. Now, I know empire is not a term that we use in the US among polite company, but I think it's important to understand that the US wants to dominate the world and certainly has since 1945, the end of World War II, except for the area where the Soviets were dominant. But the US has been at war through them, and then the Soviet Empire collapsed in 1989 in Eastern Europe, and then the Soviet Union itself collapsed in 1991. Now, tied into this, though, is that the US has never accepted the former Soviet Union, much less Russia, its successor, as a genuine partner or anything like this. And one of the key ways they worked is through an institution they call the National Endowment for Democracy. NED is important to understand because it has been created by the US government. It was passed through the Congress. It's financed annually through US Congress appropriations. They get about 90% or more of their funding from the US Congress. And it has four interesting groups that are sort of the core institutes, as they call it. It's the national wing of the Democratic Party, the national wing of the Republican Party, the US Chamber of Commerce, and the international wing of the AFL-CIO. And that's called the Solidarity Center. Now, they're all operating in around the world. We don't know all the operations. The NED is operating in about 90 different countries, and the AFL-CIO is operating in about 60, including in the Ukraine. So one of the organizations that they're supporting is the Confederation of Free Trade Unions of the Ukraine. All right, now this group is people now coming out of that 2014 so-called revolution at Maidan. You had basically Zelenskyy was a front, but the armed actions were the Azov Battalion and other fascist organizations. Zelensky's largely been a front since then, and he has imposed a neoliberal program on workers and the people of the Ukraine. However, what gets ignored is that since 2014, Cris alluded to it, I'm going to say a couple of words more, is that the people in the eastern part of Ukraine, see, Ukraine is not a unified country. The eastern part near Russia are Russian speaking, very focused towards Russia. Those in the west are focused towards Europe. When Yanukovych refused to accept the deal from the EU and decided to take the Russian.
We have about a minute or so left.
Thank you. When Yanukovych refused to accept the EU deal, which was the inferior deal, that's when they put the coup into effect. Since 2014, since that uprising, there has been a war going on in the eastern part of Ukraine, in the what's called the Donbass region. Something like 14,000 people have been killed. So this has been something that's going on. Now, one of the things you have to understand is the National Endowment for Democracy has been operating in Ukraine since at least 1991. And they've been building up organizations because the purpose of NED is not to respond to things getting out of control for the US empire, but find local organizations to build up. And they've been doing this with political parties like the Svoboda Party, the right sector, and like I say, the Confederation of Free Trade Unions. So what I want to understand, and what's important about understanding this is by understanding this rise of fascism and the activity against those in the Donbass region, is it destroys the US propaganda thing, in that what we're putting out is all Ukrainians are good, that they're united, they're one big happy family, and all Russians are bad. Well, the Ukrainians are not united. There's been a war against Eastern Ukrainians for the last 8 years. And with that, I think I'll stop. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you, Kim. Thank you very much. Once again, I'll just remind people who are viewing this, if you have comments or questions, please put them in the Q&A section. Please put, if you're one of the endorsing organizations, please put your name and your endorsing organization beside your name so we can give you an opportunity to comment when all of our speakers are done. Our next speaker is Bob Suberi, also with the Veterans for Peace, and he's going to be speaking specifically to the issue of Zelenskyy and the Azov Battalion. Kim gave us kind of a view of a number of different organizations in Ukraine. Bob is going to focus specifically on the Azov Battalion and Zelenskyy.
Actually, I'm going to focus on Volodymyr Zelenskyy as a Jew and his interaction with the neo-Nazi fascism in his country in general. I mean, certainly the majority of Ukrainians are not Nazis. However, Nazis were not very strong before they took power in Nazi Germany. The fact that they have been very successful in gaining influence and power through the use of violence and fear-mongering. In fact, Ukrainian nationalist contingent threatened Zelenskyy directly should he try to curtail their actions in the Donbass. So Zelenskyy has had to work with the extreme right-wing nationalists in order to stay alive and prosecute this war. He's been aided by the West that whitewashes neo-Nazi collaboration and paints a heroic, self-sacrificing picture of the Ukrainian leader. Even the Anti-Defamation League, established over 100 years ago to fight anti-Semitism, whitewashed the resurrection of an infamous Nazi collaborator who became a national Ukrainian hero. Anti-Semitism has been weaponized to attack left-wing critics of Israel and also Palestinians, but never to attack useful neo-Nazis. Zelenskyy is trying desperately to enlist Israeli help, yet Israel is reluctant to comply given their compromised relationship with Russia. But his support for Israel is unconditional. Last May, Zelenskyy cynically portrayed Israel as the victim when Israeli warplanes were bombarding civilian targets in Gaza. Yet in a speech to Israeli lawmakers, he was ripped apart when he made the comparison of Ukraine's suffering to the Holocaust. Israel is careful they're careful to balance their appeasement of Russia with their demonstration of concern for what it is with Ukraine. We should take heed, however, of Zelenskyy's appeal to Israel and his aspirations to become, and I quote, a second Israel. His collaboration with right-wing nationalists in Ukraine has abundant precedents in recent Israeli history and their support for brutal authoritarian juntas around the world. Do we excuse Ukraine so it can become another right-wing belligerent? If so, why? Because they're white Europeans? Is this a case where the neo-Nazis are the good guys? Do we really want a second Israel? A country that has cultivated supportive relationships with people like Bolsonaro in Brazil, Duterte in the Philippines, Orban in Hungary, just to name a few. Israel also facilitated arms sales to the brutal junta in Guatemala after the Carter administration terminated them. They were complicit in continuing their US allies' devastating attacks on the Nicaraguan people after the Iran-Contra affair was disclosed. And they supported South Africa and is suspected of having assisted their nuclear weapons program. Even before the establishment of the State of Israel, the Jewish terrorist organization, the Stern Gang, tried to collaborate with the Nazis in 1941 in order to oust Britain from Palestine, knowing full well what was going on in the concentration camps.
Excuse me, Bob, you have about a minute or so left.
Okay. But what about the more logical comparison of Ukraine with the plight of the Palestinians? Of course, that's a comparison that neither Zelenskyy nor the Israelis want to make. After all, if Ukrainians see themselves as Israelis, well, I presume that their Russian enemies must be the Palestinians. The Zionist propaganda, or Hasbara, has jumped on this immediately. There are articles in Haaretz, in the Times of Israel, and the Jerusalem Post, and in the forward with titles such as Ukraine and Palestine, a false and facile analogy. Ukraine and Palestine, the false equivalence. Ukraine is not Palestine. Ukraine-Russia is different from Israel-Palestine. And all this is to say nothing of the hypocrisy of the selective application of sanctions against Russia versus Israel and BDS. I want to give you one quote. This goes back to 1895. It's a quote from Zionism's founding father, Theodor Herzl. And he predicted, and I quote, "The anti-Semites will become our most dependable friends. The anti-Semitic countries are allies." So, of course, none of this is brand spanking new.
Thank you, Bob. I think your presentation generated a little bit of commentary, but I will hold that off until we're finished with the other speakers. I'll hold off sharing that till we finish with all the speakers. Our next speaker is going to speak about one of the problems that I think the whole world should be concerned about, and that is nuclear weapons and NATO. Haig Hovaness, excuse me, is a co-chair along with me of the Green Party Peace Action Committee, Green Party US Peace Action Committee. Haig.
Thanks, Madeline. I'm going to jump right in to make the most of my time. What you're looking at here is a map of Europe, and Ukraine is down around here. And you should be aware there are 160 US nuclear bombs positioned at various NATO bases in Europe. They're delivered by aircraft from various nations, and they're all the B-61 type. It's 20 times more powerful than the Hiroshima bomb. So 350 kilotons, and say goodbye to any city that lands on, or any city that's even close to a military target. So who decides when those bombs get used? Pretty much on our side, it's the American president. People like to make light about this briefcase. They call it the football because it's passed around by people who travel with the president. What's inside is secret, but there have been revelations by insiders. It's basically got the codes that the president reads off to authorize a nuclear strike, and it's got a stack of attack plans that he can choose among, ranging from a token small strike to a theater exchange to a massive nuclear launch. And one of the things that struck me studying this question over the years is the strange lack of concern that Americans have for those attack plans. And eventually I realized the reason is to know what cities will be destroyed, to know how many people will be killed, involves consent. As long as we don't know what's in there, if that terrible apocalyptic event happens, we can say, like the good Germans, we didn't know. Nobody told us that these things would happen. And that's why nobody is curious. No congressmen want to know the scope of the attack plans. It's never mentioned, and we make light of the football. So I'm going to show you a brief simulation of what escalation looks like. This was done by Princeton University a few years ago, and it just takes 3 or 4 minutes. So I'll just start it now. And just to wrap up, what people don't understand is how quickly all this can happen. If you look, these are the figures given in the course of the video, in case you didn't note them, but these are just direct casualties. Generally, the radiation for largely unsheltered populations would result in fatalities and severe injuries, at least double these numbers. And if you look at it, if the escalation proceeds without interruption, the whole thing is over in half a day, maybe 6 hours at most. So when people say people are bluffing, the chances are small. It's not likely that anything will happen. This is an apocalyptic, unprecedented, unspeakable disaster that's on a hair trigger. And because of the peculiarity of our national policy, one person has the ability to do this in an unchallenged manner. The only thing the vice president does is confirm that it's the president that's issued the order. The only way it can be stopped is if some military officer commits treason and defies a presidential order. So that's where we are. We've given one person the power to kill 100 million people with one decision. And this is where the Ukraine war can go if it spirals out of control. Thanks.
Thank you, Haig. That's an extremely sobering presentation there. I mean, I think there have been activists around the world who've called for some of these nuclear weapons to be taken off of hair trigger alert, so something like this might not happen, but it never transpired. And we're at a point where the more weapons we send to Ukraine, NATO or otherwise, the closer we get to tripping over the wrong wire and setting this off. And I think it's something we need to think about, whether, and at the time that all the nukes are unleashed, nobody's going to be thinking about who's to blame and who started it. We're all going to be suffering the consequences. So next up is Zaki Baruti from the Universal African Peoples Organization to talk about patterns of colonialism.
Good evening.
Good evening.
Okay, just coming after that sobering presentation, that's very powerful that the past presenter just made. Is very sobering, but my comments will be focusing on colonialism and in terms of the hypocrisy. First of all, let me just emphasize the word, the hypocrisy of this government in the whole process, this Ukraine crisis. Just imagine for a moment if at the height of the Union, the Soviet Union of Soviet Socialist Republics and the Warsaw Pact had a relationship with Mexico and wanted Mexico to join the Warsaw Pact, what kind of reaction would be coming from this US government, as personified actually by the Cuban crisis and the illegal embargo that's still causing havoc in Cuba. But hypocrisy
Zaki, your video is not working. Could you stop your video and start it again?
Okay, I'm having, I don't know what's going on here.
Seems that Zaki's disconnected. You might move on and we can come back to him later.
Moving on. Yeah, no, I know. Moving on would be to me as co-chair of GPACs and I will be focusing in on Joe Biden's role in all this. And then I will have a little bit more time than some of the other speakers, because I'm also going to talk about some of the racist imagery and political maneuvers. And I hope Zaki Baruti can get on after I'm finished to highlight some of the things that I probably will have left out. But I mean, nobody's here. We're saying that more weapons into that region are not going to end the conflict, or only going to escalate the conflict, and that we need to come up with a negotiated, we need to come up with a solution that will stop the violence, but not escalate it. So anyway, that was my role as moderator. Now I'm coming in to give my presentation. So I did a little bit of some research on Joe Biden and his involvement in Ukraine. And as a senator, he sponsored 6 pieces of legislation in regard to Ukraine, and he co-sponsored 33 others. And he became a point person for Ukraine under Obama. And he had as one of his goals at that time, helping Ukraine forge a path to NATO membership. This in spite of him and many other experts on foreign policy or international relations saying that that kind of a maneuver and move would likely be a red line for Putin and could result in him in provoking something not that much different than what we see right now. Now, that was his purpose going back to 2014 under President Obama. He traveled to Ukraine 6 times under Obama, and he helped engineer $2 billion of financial assistance to Ukraine under Obama. And during the Obama administration, Ukrainian soldiers were trained. Yes, up until then, Ukrainians didn't have a real army, and they didn't know how, they didn't have weapons, and they didn't know they needed training to fight. But as we look at what's happened, and they also got negotiated a significant loan from the International Monetary Fund. So you put all that together, it doesn't look so innocent. It looks like it's deliberately preparing for what we see now. And if somebody says Putin underestimated the strength of Ukrainian army, that would be because at one point there was none. And now, this army is fortified by the United States and the United States weapons and training. So the United States has been using Ukraine as a proxy, or as a way of getting to Russia and Putin for a long time, since at least 2014, if not before. And so on March 26th, we heard Joe Biden say that Putin can't remain the leader of Russia anymore, that he can't work with Putin, and then basically called for regime change. Well, you've never seen so many people scramble to cover up somebody's words as you saw after Biden said that. But Biden didn't really walk it back. Some of his advisors said, oh no, he didn't really mean regime change. But Biden continued to say that, yes, that is what he meant, was regime change. Now, we all should understand, as living in the United States since 9/11, that regime change wars under international law and the UN Charter are blatantly illegal. So for Biden to call for regime change in Russia, not only is it something that would be really hard to do, it's also illegal. And if we're trying to negotiate our way out of this and try to come up with a quote unquote peaceful solution, regime change and threatening regime change certainly isn't it. And so the other thing that Biden has said, and the media have repeated over and over again, is that this was unprovoked. What Russia did to Ukraine was unprovoked. And I hope we've sufficiently shown tonight that there were lots of reasons why it happened. Doesn't excuse it necessarily, but it certainly, to say this was an unprovoked action of Putin is incorrect. Even the Pope acknowledged today that there were a lot of provocations along the way. So it's in the United States, this propaganda against Russia, it's 77 years in the making. And people really, it doesn't take too much persuasion to have the United States or people in the United States demonize Russia, the Soviet Union, then Russia, then Putin, and everything together. We do remember, I know I do, because a lot of my ancestors came from that region, Russia, Lithuania, Ukraine, and the like, that Russians lost 26 million people in World War II. Almost every family sacrificed somebody to World War II. There were Russians who actually liberated some of the Jews from concentration camps, some of the concentration camps. And so, to totally demonize Russia is not really, not true and not helpful, in my opinion. And then for people to say, we're going to fight until there's nobody left standing, we're going to bleed Russia, until there's nobody left standing in Ukraine. Well, that again, how is this helping the Ukrainian people? I don't see it. Now, I want to talk a little bit about the racist imagery.
Excuse me, Madelyn, you have about a minute or so left.
Out of the 7?
Yes.
All right, so I'll go through this quickly, and other people can fill in. There's a whole list. I mean, if you were watching the news at any point along the way or following the news on Twitter or Facebook, a whole host of news commentators making racist statements, such as, oh, gee, this happened in Ukraine. It didn't happen miles away in places like Syria, Afghanistan, Yemen. The implication was in Muslim countries where those commentators were saying you'd expect such a thing to happen, but not in Ukraine with blonde-haired, blue-eyed people who look like Europeans, like somebody you could live next door to. And this, this is part of the problem. Popular Resistance on March 4th, 2022. They said Fox News, New York Times, Washington Post, CNN, MSNBC, 1,300 stories on Ukraine and the conflict, 2 on what was happening in Syria, and 1 on Somalia, and 0 on the Saudi-led war in Yemen. And I would add Palestine, in fact, and I hope I can end on this one. I still have time for this one. Ahed Tamimi, who was one of the Palestinian freedom fighters, if you will, in Palestine, she, confronting an IDF soldier, that image was sent around on social media, and it was labeled as a Ukrainian girl telling the Russian soldier to go home. Now, even I recognize that as Ahed Tamimi. I mean, it's not like it was it was hard to identify if you had been following anything that had been going on in Palestine. So it really does bother me on this level, where we see Zelenskyy every night. We have him making commentary every night. We have him saying this is a war crime. We have Joe Biden saying this is a war crime. Joe, Talk about your own war crimes. Talk about US war crimes. Talk about the other wars. And then maybe I'll listen to when you call Putin a war criminal. Let's put this all into the proper context and history. Thank you so much. All right, so is Zaki Baruti, is he back?
Yeah, yes, I am.
Okay, good. So then you can amplify, you talk more about racism and colonialism and amplify what I said. Thank you.
Absolutely. And again, I don't know how much was captured in my opening statement in terms of the absolute hypocrisy of this government as well as NATO as relates to the contradiction in that Russia was asking simply that Ukraine declared that it would not become a NATO member, when if I did, reverse that, if Russia had and the Warsaw Pact under the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics had reached out to Mexico and had a friendly government there, what would be the reaction of this government? I just want to bring out that hypocrisy. But also the hypocrisy of NATO historically in terms of its treatment of people of color around the world. A clear example, the Berlin Conference of 1894, where many of the most powerful NATO countries were participating in that conference to carve up Africa. And those powerful European countries, including France, England, Spain, Portugal, Italy, Germany, carved up Africa, exploited Africa to great proportions in terms of stealing the natural resources of Africa, in terms of the impact such as gold, oil, cocoa, bauxite, rubber, zinc, cotton, tin, uranium, cobalt, phosphates, copper, lead, and we could go on and on and on in terms of, if we, as the Madelyn had made mention, if we talk, as they criticize Putin as a war criminal, all of the governments of past all the way up into the present are really war criminals. When you look at the impact of the present day impact or the different types of regime changes that was engineered by the CIA as well as other NATO members within recent years, including the overthrow of the popularly elected government of Ghana under the leadership of Kwame Nkrumah. When you look at what happened in the Congo under the leadership of Patrice Lumumba, that was engineered by the CIA along with Belgium officials. When you look at the fact of what happened, actually the overthrow of the elected government in Iran in 1952, Mohammed Mossadegh, I hope I pronounced that right, as well as the utter destruction of Libya under the leadership of Gaddafi, the removal in Haiti of the popularly elected president, John Aristide, as well as the overthrow of the popularly elected government of Allende, Salvador Allende in Chile, speaks to the hypocrisy, absolute hypocrisy, and the racism that emanates as an extension of colonialism and imperialism. And so it's no kind of way in terms of where our organization is that we can be in support of what this government is doing as far as helping to escalate the violence that takes place in Ukraine. As well as on the racial side, many of us have seen the views when many of the African students were trying to escape the violence and the kind of mistreatment that they were getting from the Ukrainians in of themselves, the government. Then again, that raises the spectrum of hypocrisy and racism to the highest level, as well as the kinds of dollars that's going to be poured into the Ukrainian crisis, when right here in this country, the level of poverty that exists, the homelessness, people without proper health care, points out again a glaring hypocrisy that exists. So our organization
Zaki, you have about a minute or so left.
Okay, so with that said, the real war criminals, in our opinion, is right here in this country, in many of those capitals of those NATO countries that I just cited. And but a sobering reality, as I think one of the presenters had presented, Brother Haig, Hovaness, is that if we don't get a handle on this particular crisis, humanity in of itself on this planet can be totally endangered. So we have to some kind of way force the powers to be to sit down and negotiate to put an end to what is taking place there. But we always got to understand the underlying causes. And in my opinion, the underlying causes is that NATO has an agenda to be the world power and diminish the role of Russia in terms of world politics. So with that said, again, it's just hypocrisy, hypocrisy, hypocrisy. That's all I just want to say. It's just hypocrisy in the overall governmental policies of this country as well as NATO. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Zaki. I wanted to add, when you talked about the African students in Ukraine, just the other day, there were articles about Germany asking the Afghan refugees to leave Germany in order to make room for more Ukrainian refugees. So that's, consistent with that kind of pattern. So we have two more speakers. Then we'll get to the comments and questions. So hold on, everybody. Our next speaker is Don Fitz with Green Social Thought, and he's going to be talking about thought control in the US media.
The troops are confiscating incubators and putting premature babies on the floor to die. The crime is so horrible that we absolutely must destroy Iraq. That was September of 1990. It was the key event in the momentum for the first war in Iraq. There was one witness, a 15-year-old Kuwaiti girl who had been coached by a public relations firm, who we now know made up the entire story. As a result of that, there were 0.5 to 1 million Iraqis killed during that war. Let's go to slide 5, the next slide, which shows what has happened. Vietnam, if you lived through that war, you know that you saw images of what was happening. The military and the Pentagon changed that. And by the time the Iraq war came around, embedded journalism was born. And for the first time, the independent press was forbidden to actually report without going through the military. When you see images of people hurting in the Ukraine, it's hard not to worry about them. When you hear that Russians did it to them, it's very hard not to dislike Russians. But far too often, there's no questioning if the images are accurate and if the Russians actually did what they were accused of doing. Let's go to the next slide of the Russian bear. I think Madelyn gave us the example of the Palestinian girl in 2012 who was portrayed as a Ukrainian girl standing up to the Russian military. Actually, these sort of images also occur with taking images from Syria and Libya. In the first week or two of the war, the press just fabricated whatever images they wanted you to believe. There's so many false stories that have run through the media. I have to just briefly mention a very few of them. The March 9th supposed bombing of the Mariupol maternity hospital, there were no airplanes seen by the witnesses. The March 17th bombing of the Mariupol drama theater was not by Russia at all. It's probably by Azov, but nobody knows for sure. The April 2nd report, you probably remember, and that was Bucha civilians being shot on the street with their hands tied behind their backs. If you look at the chronology, it could not have been Russians. That chronology doesn't work out. The April 9th bombing of the train station could not have been by the Russian artillery. Let's take a look at the next slide, 7 of the bio labs. Towards the end of March, we heard, I remember hearing on TV that Russia might soon use bioweapons. What the TV did not tell me was that this was because the US had been sponsoring a joint bioweapon facility with the Ukraines. The most recent fabricated story was less than 2 weeks old when on April 25th, you heard that there were up to 9,000 civilians buried in mass graves near Mariupol, which is caused by the Russian mass murders. On-site inspection found that that was a normal cemetery with no mass murders. However, about the same time, there was other story in the left press about mass graves actually being discovered. They were discovered in Ethiopia, where researchers estimated that as many as 59,000 Amhara people may have died at the hands of US allies. I did not see that on TV, on network TV. Did you see it on network TV? What's happening is that the US media does not cover mass graves that do exist in Africa, but does broadcast the fantasy of mass graves caused by the Russians. Okay, let's go to the 9 to far right, the next slide. The US actually trains commanders of the neo-Nazi Azov Battalion. Let's go to the next slide. This is an example of on the far right is a US trainer, and the other 2 people are an Azov militants. Okay, and let's go to the next slide.
About a minute or so left.
Okay, great. Okay, let's go to the next slide. This is the mark of the Wolfsganger that Nazis wore in their sleeve in World War II, and now on the right side is the same image, which is used currently by the Azov Battalion. The goal of the war media is very clear: to get the public to blame Russia for genocide so that Azov can perpetuate the genocide of Russian speakers in the Donbass as it has done since 2014. The false reporting means that there is zero reason to believe that Russia is any worse than the Azov Battalion. It appears to me that the Ukraine is a dress rehearsal for dismantling Russia, just like they did to Yugoslavia, breaking it up into pieces, and showing that Joe Biden is the person who can overturn revolutions in Nicaragua, Venezuela, and Cuba. Thank you.
Wow, it's another powerful presentation like Haig's, to make us really sobering, giving us a lot to think about. I'm sure that our next and final speaker will do something similar, give us a lot to think about. Ajamu Baraka is our last speaker tonight, and he's with the Black Alliance for Peace, and a name that many of you probably already know. Ajamu?
Thank you. Thank you so much, Madelyn. And thank you everyone who has come out this evening to be part of this very important conversation. And also it's an honor to be on this distinguished panel, to hear all of these enlightening presentations. I know that I had a chance to learn a lot. I'm going to touch on just a few of the points that were made, and then sort of close out in terms of some positions that we see as members of the Black Liberation Movement as it relates to Ukraine and US imperialism, and indeed the future of this planet. As I said, I learned a lot, and I'm so glad that we had a chance to touch on a number of important issues. You know, these kind of conversations are taking place across the country. They're taking place really in various parts of the world because of the importance of this conflict. This conflict has had global impact. And even though it's happening in Europe and the entire planet is being sucked in again to the machinations of Europeans, we have to pay attention to it because of its potential impact. We saw from the presentation, the chilling presentation of Haig, that reminded us of the impact of a nuclear exchange between the US and Western Europe and Russia, an exchange that would have a monumental, devastating consequences for global humanity. Not a war that no one would win. Is that kind of information that we need to try to get to the US public more, because of this strange cavalier attitude that so many people seem to have when it comes to the possibility of a nuclear conflict. You even have US policymakers who have constructed a theory in terms of how the US can in fact win a nuclear exchange. Now, there was a point in US culture that those kinds of attitudes and positions were ridiculed in movies like Dr. Strangelove. But today they're seen as having a viability. And that, I think, demonstrates how strange and dangerous US culture has really become. Stan reminded us that, we talk about the militarism and war, but we also have to be reminded of the impact of militarism on the environment, on the ecology, the global ecology. But he also reminded us too, in his presentation, that, what I took from that was, he revealed the contradiction, inherent contradiction in the notion that the same forces, the same corporate international monopoly finance capital that controls the world are going to be the same forces that will voluntarily make the kind of transition that needs to be made in order for us to move from the kind of insane consumption we have, fueled by relatively cheap fossil fuel, to renewables. The contradiction is that basically that's not going to happen unless we are able to take power from those elements. They're not going to make that transition. And that is the message that we have to really come to terms with. Because people, I think many people, maybe too many people, believe that it's going to be just some kind of appeal to the rationality of the capitalist oligarchy, and that they're going to then pursue policies that will be beneficial to global humanity. Is not going to happen. Barbara reminded us that, with the evolution of Ukraine, or the Ukrainian national aspirations, that was something that had a historical foundation. She also reminded us too that, about the role of NATO. One thing, though, we have to be reminded of in terms of the NATO role is that, of course, it had no real mission after 1991, except to be the military arm of US and Western imperialism. So yes, the rationale for why NATO was established, was accepted until 1991. But the real rationale of NATO was then exposed after 1991 as part of the aggressive imperialist tools used to maintain US and Western global hegemony. And that role has to be dealt with, because as a consequence of this conflict, NATO has been rehabilitated, if you will, with the public that believes that NATO has a role to play in Europe. Well, for those of us from the global South, we've been on the receiving end of NATO and its policies. We're absolutely clear about the role of this instrument, this structure. We see it as a structure of white supremacy, of global white power. And that's how we frame it. This issue of the nature of the Ukrainian state is something we have to deal with also. That basically, you know, one of the ways in which they've been able to galvanize public support in the US for this conflict and for the Ukrainian state is to completely whitewash its real nature. We've heard from a number of the speakers about what happened after 2014, when Viktor Yanukovych who was democratically elected, was overthrown with the full support of the United States government and even some elements of Western Europe governments. But of course, the US stepped in and marginalized the European states because their objective was basically to take Ukraine. And that's exactly what they did. But what they put in place, my friends, and we heard it over and over again, is something that could not really be defined as democratic. That what they put in place was a state that was committed to an aggressive stance vis-a-vis Russia, a state that would not recognize that their own citizens in the East had a legitimate right to reject a coup. In the East was the real political base of Viktor Yanukovych. And they said, we don't accept the coup and we don't accept the legitimacy of this coup government. The response from the coup government was what? To declare that they were a domestic terrorist, to basically to excise them from the Ukrainian state with the help of the Western media. They became not Ukrainian citizens, they became pro-Russian separatists, which means that now you can do anything you want to them. And so the coup government did what? They attacked their own citizens. They waged war against their own citizens. And of course, in that war, there was assistance that came from the Russian forces, and that attack was beaten back. You had an agreement called the Minsk Agreement, Minsk 1 and 2. The Minsk 1 second agreement was supposed to be an agreement in which there's going to be a ceasefire. There's going to be relative autonomy in the East for the Ukrainians. And it would be the framework, the diplomatic framework for ending the conflict in that country. But did that happen? No. The Ukrainian government ignored it basically and allowed for their forces to continue to wage war on the East, while they simultaneously were propped up by the US and Western European powers, their military that is, preparing them for the eventual war that they knew was going to be waged in Ukraine, okay? So this is something we have to also deal with because again, the nature of this Ukrainian government being a government geared toward militarism and a government that was recognized across the planet among the ultra-nationalist and neo-Nazi forces as a government that was favorable to their cause. And in fact, it's documented that something like 17,000 white supremacists traveled to Ukraine to receive ideological and military training. It became the epicenter of the transnational white supremacist movement, okay? That's a fact, okay? It's also a fact that when Zelenskyy was elected on a platform of peace and anti-corruption, that the first things he started to do was basically to impose a neoliberal economic order. They began to systematically continue with the suppression of Russian culture, and they began to suppress the left forces that remain in Ukraine. They eliminated all of the things that the US used to condemn other governments like Venezuela, talking about how do you close down the television stations of the opposition? Well, Zelenskyy closed all of them down, okay, with no pushback from the U.S. and from the West, okay? So we've got to raise these kinds of issues. And Cris touched on what happened in Odessa, but there's a piece of information we need to also add with that with the attack by the neo-Nazis against trade unionists in Odessa, they burnt 48 people alive, okay? That's the nature of this backward racist government in Ukraine. Kim touched on the fact that Zelenskyy is a fraud, and that's exactly how we see him. Bob talked about, again, the neo-Nazis we're talking about today, this evening, and how they, in fact, were, that it's a mistake to suggest that if they didn't have a strong base electorally, that they were sort of marginal in terms of power. It reminded us that the Nazis in Germany didn't have a strong base until they were given power. That was the concern that many people had when it came to the Nazis in Ukraine. Madelyn talked about, and it talked about again, the 8 years of preparation that was being done to prepare for this war. Because what they wanted a proxy war, and they wanted it to be limited to the Donbass, okay? They didn't really expect a expanded conflict than what they had. But the main objective was going to be that proxy conflict. And the Biden administration knew when it was going to start, because they basically don't want to put the plan in place, okay? And we'll talk about that some more. But, you know, there's normalized white supremacy. Madeleine touched on again. It's something we got to deal with. You know, Zelenskyy, you know, became, in our opinion, the new high priestess of white supremacy. The normalization of white supremacy. Zelenskyy talks about Europeanness, and we have to defend the West. And, you know, what is the West? Is the West really a geographical reality, or is it an ideal? It's actually both. But what's more powerful and dangerous about the West is its ideal. This unchallenged notion of civilizational superiority when it comes to the West. Zelenskyy was saying things that if Trump would have said it, people would have been outraged. But coming from him, it's been normalized that we got to defend the West from those non-Western barbarians. And even though, you know, we're talking about two Slavic people, we know that basically in 1917, the Russians were jettisoned from the category of whiteness when they became communists. And they have not been allowed to come back into the white and European fold ever since. And Don talked about the importance of how ideologically we have been shaped to see this conflict in certain ways. Reminding us again of what we're up against with the neo-fascism developing in the US, being driven by who? The Trump forces, who are basically not really in power? No, the neoliberal fascists that control the state here in this country. There's totalitarian corporate fascists who are controlling or attempting to control ideals and information in order to frame things in a way that would be favorable to them. We've got to struggle against that. And finally, our dear brother, Zaki, who reminded us of the kinds of wars that the colonial powers have been waging from the very beginning. We talk about the fact that Europe became Europe beginning in 1492. And so we're not confused, those of us who are part of the African revolutionary movement, about what we're up against. And that's what we say, because Brother Zaki and myself on the leadership body of the Black is Back Coalition. And we say, you know, we're not going to engage in conversations with these folks and trying to persuade them when they engage in imperialist wars. We say, turn imperialist wars into wars against imperialism. We understand we have to fight, okay? You're not going to persuade them, okay? That's our responsibility. So as I move toward closure, let me say this again, as part of the African revolutionary process, we're absolutely clear. We say that the US, EU, NATO axis of domination is the primary enemy of global humanity. The US is the only state, that talks about clearly, openly, their commitment to full spectrum dominance. They say openly, it's about our global dominance, And so when people talk about the imperialism coming from the Russians with their $1.9 trillion GDP, that's bunch of nonsense. The Russians, their total military budget doesn't even equal to the increases in the military budget in the US over the last 2 years. Just the increases, okay? They've been outspent something like 6-1. Okay, so this notion of trying to equalize something called Russian imperialism with the US and the West is absolute theoretical nonsense, but yet people embrace it, including this latte left we have in the US. NATO is no way that any self-respecting African could be on the same side with any forces in support of NATO. No way at all. So my friends, we have some responsibilities. You have some responsibilities, because we're not going to be able to defeat this monster unless we are much more effective in reversing the kind of confusion we see among the liberal left in this country. And that means we've got to engage in ideological struggle where there's no misunderstanding of where people should be politically. The lines of demarcation have already been drawn. Unfortunately, there's a line already being drawn between the white West and the rest of us. Okay, because we see how, with all of the criminality been directed toward the global South, the ongoing criminality, we see that the response from the public to the war in Ukraine, and no one wants to see war. But when you see the kind of universal meaning Europe, response to that conflict, and how the Ukrainian people have been embraced versus the ongoing catastrophe in Yemen, the destruction of Libya, the 9 million Africans who have died in the resource wars in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, the attack, the starvation taking place in Afghanistan, the destruction of Iraq, the illegal occupation of Syria.
Ajamu, your time is up. If you want to just wrap it up for us, I'd appreciate it.
Okay. All right. So we have a responsibility to lay this out in the way that it really is, that reflects the reality that we're up against. And our responsibility also is to organize ourselves to engage in the struggle we have to engage in. And it means, even with some of our friends, there's no way, for example, that the Green Party can uphold itself and its principles while you have major spokespersons who are making arguments for sending military hardware, military weapons to Ukraine. That is a contradiction that needs to be dealt with by the Green Party. And I end it there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ajamu. So much to think about, and so much that's inspiring from what you said. We have a whole host of comments and questions in the Q&A, but I think our first order of business is to ask if there's anybody from a co-sponsoring organization who would like to not to make it orally, but to type in a comment that we will read. And then we'll take comments from people who are not co-sponsoring organizations. Is there anybody out there who's a member of one of the co-sponsoring, endorsing organizations that has a quick comment to make? I see quite a few. Yeah, I see a lot of really interesting questions. All right, so I guess then we need to move. Oh, hold on. Yeah, we need to move to the questions and that have been posted in the Q&A. And I'm going to try to categorize some of them, you know, put them together so that, because we can't have every panelist respond to every question. We have 10 panelists, that would take us 20 minutes per question. So I think the first question I want to ask about this, since it came up several times, is one, what do the panelists think about Putin's desire to negotiate? Will he negotiate? And also, that goes along with the question of whether or not this was an unprovoked, you know, the whole question about whether it was provoked or unprovoked. Maybe we'll put those two questions together. And then I will read this one because it comes from a co-sponsoring organization. The Green Party of New Jersey thanks everyone and stands against sending more arms. That is contrary to true peaceful negotiations, sending more arms into Ukraine, because that's contrary to true peaceful negotiations. But so one category of questions has to do with whether this was provoked or unprovoked, and is Putin willing to negotiate, in our opinion. And the second one, there's quite a few questions regarding the German Greens and the European Greens, and why is the German Green Party reactionary? And I think that will be a good starting point. So I know, Barbara, did you want to take a crack at one of these? Or anybody else for that matter?
Yeah, I have to say, after reading and learning more about the situation with Ukraine and Russia and the United States, I feel like the United States was poking the bear, for a better way to say it. And I go back to NATO. I mean, it was clear Russia, I think it's important to separate Russia from Putin. And that's hard to do, I know. But I think that Russia was feeling very hemmed in by NATO and very threatened by the ability of other nations to come on board and surround the borders of Russia with nuclear armament. So I have to go to the side that I think it was provoked by the United States.
Anyone else to chime in on that?
Yeah, Kim.
Kim, go ahead. I guess, yeah, people, panelists, if you raise your hands, then I can see you. And then after Kim, Haig.
Okay. I think, I mean, I definitely disagree. Agree, excuse me. NATO was provoking this. This was under the United States. One of the interesting questions that's never been presented in the media, in my mind, is why now? See, because I went to a talk by John Mearsheimer in 2015, Mearsheimer and Rick Rosoff in Evanston, Illinois, and we were talking about this stuff. And Mearsheimer pointed out that even the right-wing U.S. ambassador to Russia, John McFaul, said that Putin did not have aggressive actions. And none of this started until the Maidan uprising in 2014. So you cannot ignore that uprising, the role of the U.S. in that, the role that I tried to lay out as far as the National Endowment for Democracy. Mm-hmm. This was provoked. Now, that's not saying Putin should have done this, but it certainly helps us to understand that. I think that's crucial. I think Putin has said that if Ukraine would be neutral, would guarantee not going into NATO, that he would be willing to negotiate. And I think that he's got a lot more truthfulness on his side than Biden does on his. Let's put it that way.
Hey, Haig.
Yes, I'd like to speak to the question about the willingness to negotiate. The Minsk 1 and 2 accords came as a result of that willingness. The Russians wanted to have some autonomy from the breakaway provinces, the ones that didn't approve of the coup-installed government. And if they were bent on conquest, then why would they have wasted their time with that proposal, which was signed off on by the convening powers of the accord and by Ukraine, and completely ignored by the Ukrainians. Moreover, in the run-up to the war, the Russians put forth a draft treaty for NATO to back away from their borders. And had that been accepted, it probably wouldn't have been war. And finally, there were negotiations where the Russians presented their demands. And for a short time, the talks in Turkey looked like Ukraine was about to make some concessions in terms of not joining NATO. But then suddenly their position switched. And so the question, the old expression is cui bono, who benefits from the prolongation of the war? Might it be a government that wants to bleed an adversary? Might it be a military industrial complex that sees even greater revenues from this outpouring of weaponry? I don't think the citizens of Ukraine benefit from the prolongation of the war.
No.
So I think all the gestures toward negotiation support the fact that the Russians would have preferred a negotiated outcome.
Cris, and then Ajamu, and then I want to say something, and then Ajamu.
Yes, I just wanted to cite a reference that I found helpful on this. I think that the war was provoked, and one of the sources I looked at was the Historical Unity of Russians and Ukrainians, written by Vladimir Putin. It's 5,000 word essay, which isn't long, but it comes in an ebook on the internet. And before you read it, there's some person who says, don't read this, it's all trash and hype. And then at the end of it, they ask all these professors from other universities, some from a lot from the United States, and it says, well, this was the worst thing I ever read, and they call them deranged and stuff. But in it I found it to be, the first half is a history of the relationship of Russia and Ukraine, which I mean, that's Barbara's camp. Everybody noticed how we had to divide this up because there's so many facts and stuff we don't know. But Putin says those who seek diplomacy are labeled pro-Russia. These people are killed. The entire Ukrainian state will be built on hate and anger. Never allow, he says, he will never allow the people who are close to us to do that to us. And then he says, how do Canada and the United States live together? They are sovereign, but not fighting. We respect the Ukrainian language and people. Together, we have always been stronger. Russia has never been anti-Ukraine. And also, Popular Resistance points out that the hatred of Putin is so pervasive, it goes into TV commercials, and Stephen Colbert nightly does this. And I appreciate Ajamu's comment on why the US is attacking Russia, because it made a revolution in 1917, and that challenges imperialism to its core.
All right, I just want to make a quick comment about, because there was a question about, people's position on this panel about the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. And I just want to say this, that, and it ties it back to what Cris just said. If all we do is focus on demonizing the leader of another country, we do this all the time. But if that's all we do, then we never get the benefit of the history, the conflict, the different, the history of the conflict, the context for the conflict, or any of those things. And I think that the people of this country are sadly misinformed. There are also people who've been deplatformed, censorship here. People like Chris Hedges, Lee Camp, other sources that people have had to get their news independently. They've been deplatformed, meaning they cannot have their shows anymore on the platforms they used to have. So we are living in media is under tight control. And so I think we have a responsibility to talk about the ways that this was provoked, and also what the history and the context are. Ajamu, you had something to add?
Well, just briefly, I mean, Haig sort of touched on what I was going to, the point I was going to make in terms of just reminding us that there seemed to be some progress still being made in the negotiations between Russia and Ukraine, but in the latter part of March, it stopped, as he pointed out. And what happened was, it appears, is that again, the U.S. was not prepared to commit to a ending of the conflict, and so they apparently assured Zelenskyy and his leadership body that they should pull back, not give in, and that there was a possibility that this could be resolved in a different way, more favorable to Ukraine, once they changed the realities on the ground militarily. That was a terrible decision, because what it has resulted in is basically Ukraine is gone. The territory that has been conquered in the east is never going to go back to Ukraine. The kind of compromises they have now have to make with the U.S. Committed themselves to perpetual debt. They have an $8 billion deficit every month, and now with the Lend-Lease program that they have just entered into, people have to be reminded that the Russians and the UK government just paid off their Lend-Lease in 2006 from World War II. So basically, they have given up sovereignty. They gave up sovereignty really in 2014, but they have given up sovereignty, and in the process too, thousands of their soldiers have died unnecessarily, because there will be a political settlement at some point. And all of this is going to be for naught, because there's not going to be a victory over the Russian forces. And it's really shameful, and it's really painful to watch every day the kind of manipulation taking place, and to see these young men dying unnecessarily. Lastly, the issue of being provoked. This whole notion, I mean, the US public is so incredibly childish sometimes that it's talking about Putin. I'd never use that Putin. It's the Russian Federation, that Putin got up one morning and said, you know what? I feel like attacking Ukraine. I mean, what is, come on, but that's the level of unsophistication we have to deal with the US public. And the fact that this is taken up by people who should know better on the liberal left, to me, is just a reflection of the unprincipled positions that the US left has embraced over the last couple of decades.
Thank you, Ajamu. How about the issue of the European Greens, the German Greens, Does anyone want to touch on those?
I think,
Don?
yeah.
Yeah, okay. I'm familiar with that, especially the German Greens, because I was in the Green Party in the 1990s when Bill Clinton engineered the breakup of Yugoslavia. And for the first time since World War II, Germany actually had troops on the ground invading another country in order to break up Yugoslavia to protect the right of a country to secede from Yugoslavia. And so I criticized Joschka Fischer for that and things that I wrote, and was condemned by Greens and US Greens in several states for condemning a fellow Green. Now we have a situation where Crimea, which I think voted 96% that they wanted to be with Russia, and the Donbass, who face, if the Donbass were returned to the Azov Battalion, we saw what happened in Nazi Germany when Nazis get control of people that they don't like. And so the German Greens basically flip-flop and say that now that they do not support the right of countries to separate, even when it's absolutely vital for their existence. There was no vitality that Croatia had to leave Yugoslavia in the 1990s. I do want to say a little bit about being provoked, or is this unprovoked or provoked? I can guarantee you that if Russia made an alliance with Mexico and Mexico lined the border with nuclear missiles aimed at Los Angeles, Phoenix, Albuquerque, Austin, and Houston, nobody in the United States would have to ask if that was a provocation or not. The question wouldn't even be there. But it's a certain type of American exceptionalism where you say that America can put nuclear bombs and bomb the hell out of anybody, anywhere in the world it wants to, but nobody can ever have the same right to do something about America. That is, again, called, the phrase for it is US exceptionalism.
Okay, I have a really quick question. I think I know who did this. This is who made the film Ukraine? It's not Ukraine of Fire, is it? It's Ukraine Under Fire. Was that an Oliver Stone film?
Yes.
That's an Oliver Stone film, to the anonymous attendee who asked that question. There are a couple of other questions. I'll read these two and people can respond to the two of them together. One is from Kent Rowe. Who is our actual foe here? What is driving this conflict? Fossil fuels, arms peddlers, where is the money trail? That's the Kansas Green Party. Sorry, Kent, I should have read that sooner because I didn't see the Kansas Green Party until right now when I read it. And then the other question that goes along the lines of that is from Marianne Alachi. Let me find Marianne Alachi here. This might be an obvious question regarding economic and resource dominance, but what are the reasons for Obama and Biden to inflame the relationship between Ukraine and Russia? And what role did the relationship between Putin and Trump play with the US relationship with Ukraine?
That's a good question.
Yeah. So I see Haig has a hand up. Does anyone else want to respond to either one of these questions? All right, let's go. Haig, go ahead.
Well, briefly, from a practical point of view, our enemy here is the what's referred to as the Washington blob. It's the neocon establishment and its ancillaries in industry and the media and politics that have been on a reign of error ever since 9/11. Never has a clique or a cabal had such a long, unbroken record of failure, culminating in Afghanistan, I suppose, because Ukraine isn't over yet. But rather than drawing a line through all these wretched points of failure and holding the people accountable, they seem to be immune. Blinken was involved in the Libya disaster, and Jake Sullivan was Clinton campaign operative. And no one seems to recognize that this faction, this dominant faction, is leading us over the edge of a precipice. So that, I think, is the real adversary of any informed citizen in the United States. With regard to the resource politics, Europe and Russia are natural trading partners. European technology in exchange for Russian natural resources. If you split them away from that market, Europeans have to consume the products of the US in terms of energy, weaponry, and so forth. So it's basically a means of securing European markets for exclusive US use. That's why the Europeans will be paying for LNG, liquefied natural gas, at triple the cost of what Russian pipeline gas would be. That's why there was so much resistance to expanding the Nord Stream pipeline, because again, the Russians would be delighted to have productive trading relations with Europe, but that has been severed as a result of the hostilities in Ukraine. Again, it's cui bono. Who benefits from this state of affairs? It's not the Europeans. Inflation is raging, their utility costs are going through the roof. Their governments will probably be destabilized if this economic downturn lasts much longer. But the US benefits enormously. So that's the resource side.
All right, we have Dawn and then we have Ajamu. And we're approaching the hour of 10 o'clock. So perhaps these should be the last two responses. But I'll take my guidance from everybody else. But Don, you're first, and then Ajamu.
Okay. I want to thank Haig for what he pointed out. I also want to point out that one of the long-term goals of the U.S. is to destroy Russia and break it up into small, powerless countries, just like they did to Yugoslavia. This would allow the U.S. to get coal from the Ukraine, gas from Russia and coal to Ukraine, and cut rate prices. And what is happening here is that there's two things. There's the money side of it and there's the political side of it. What Biden is showing that he can be more successful than anybody else in getting left liberals to not worry about destroying the world from climate change as he builds up his access to fossil fuels. And he can get left liberals to not worry about destroying the world by nuclear war. And so he can consolidate himself much, much better than Trump did. Let's keep in mind that Biden is very low in the polls now. It's not just money. Trump tried to mobilize anti-Chinese hatred during the COVID by calling it the Chinese virus. He had enormous pushback. He was not able to consolidate very many people except for the ultra crackpot group. Biden, on the other hand, has shown that he can consolidate vast numbers of people, not only in the US, but in Europe, to have an anti-Russian campaign. In other words, Biden is showing that being a liberal allows you to consolidate power much better than being a reactionary like Trump. It actually Biden is more successful at getting people into the Azov Battalion than Donald Trump ever could have tried to do.
Ajamu and Zaki also after Ajamu.
Very, very briefly, because I think all the points have been made very, very clear. And I'm glad to see that we are dismissing with the analysis that looks at personalities and looking at the real driving material forces. That's the only way you come up with something that makes sense. And when you look at the situation with Ukraine and U.S. policy, it's quite clear that the objective was basically trying to starve off the precipitous decline that they have been experiencing over the last decade or so economically. they have a commitment to full spectrum dominance. One of the ways in which they wanted to maintain their position against their competitors that have been identified in the national security strategy, the Russia and China, is to basically consolidate their hold over the European market. And so one of the objectives of the Ukrainian policy was to basically disarticulate the European economy from the Russian economy. They wanted to create a situation where they couldn't stop the Germans from the investing into Nord Stream 2. But what they wanted to do was create a political pretext for them to make sure that it never came on board. And that's why they were angling toward the conflict between Ukraine and Russia. And the other thing too, in terms of the economics, who's the number one arms trader on the planet? The US. Who's number two? The Russians. So again, you follow the money. Lastly, politically, what we see in terms of US policy is also related to the realignment that took place among the ruling class in 2016. Not only did you have the neocons that had significant influence in the Obama administration, but with the rise of Trump, you had elements of the ruling class that had provided some support to the Republicans, moving over to the neoliberal Democrats. And so what you see now is a reflection of those interests. That's why those elements have to be defeated if we're going to be able to survive.
Well, thank you, Ajamu. Thanks, everyone. Zaki?
Yes,
Zaki, please.
just a couple of very brief comments. In our discussion, it just took me back to one of the paraphrasing Dr. King, that the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today, at that time, was the US government, and is still the reality today. And then secondly, in terms of, as well as when he took a position against the Vietnam War on April the 4th of 1967, 1 year later, he was assassinated, probably for his position on the war, as well as the economic questions. Finally, though, for humanity's sake, though, on the real side, we will always enter into these crises until there is a actual revolutionary change of government, starting right here in this country and throughout the many countries that comprise NATO, if we are not to have a continuation of the kinds of crises that threaten humanity.
And to build off that, Zaki, it may seem a little bit unrelated, but it is not. There is a move in the country of Colombia to elect some left-leaning people, including someone Ajamu knows very well, Francia Marquez. And 2 days ago, there were threats, credible threats on their lives, and such that they had to cancel campaign appearances. And there was no outrage from the US government, no response whatsoever. And there's NATO, Colombia is a special NATO partner with, has become a special partner with NATO. So this is what's NATO doing in the South, the Southern hemisphere, right? But these are things that if there is a move and a push in Colombia for a different kind of government, and we need to keep our eyes on what's going on there, because Duque and the Uribistas aren't going to go down easy. And if they can use threats of violence or use violence without anything being said by their neighbors to the north, that's something we need to keep our eyes open, need to keep our eyes on. Let's see. Should we take additional questions, folks, or have we kind of hit? Should we wrap it up here? And there's some other comments that I didn't read from, okay, this one is for you, Ajamu. Would Ajamu consider running for the Green Party presidential nomination in 2024? You don't have to answer it if you don't want to.
I've not given that any thought, but I'm concerned about a credible candidate for 2024, especially when it seems like one of our most credible candidates have basically, in my opinion, disqualified himself in taking a reactionary position on U.S. imperialism.
Yeah, it's a concern that many of us share, Ajamu. All right, then here there's some comments on the media not being a separate entity. It's a function of the colonial state. To liquidate the struggle to the media or NATO or other imperialist functions misses the point. The only struggle in this conversation should be centered in colonial capitalism, as it has already been stated in the chat. I don't see anything else here that, oh, well, there's something, Frank Lawrence, all of the land that Russia has came from wars they fought against. No, that Russia doesn't attack NATO countries. This is the concern that Putin won't be there very much longer. And that Russia is having a really difficult time as a country. But I don't think, oh, here's one other one. And I think this would be a good question to end on. It was a question about what the worldwide opinion polls are regarding this war. And does anyone know of a good source of information on this question? So anyone can, go ahead, Cris.
I ran into some that Putin's polls are 70% or better, but have gone up since the war. But at the same time, I saw a news item where quite a few people have left the Soviet Union and situated themselves in Georgia as the peace movement in Russia. So that's all I've heard. But we also have to keep in mind Biden's polls are sliding. And then something else that's happening in the United States is there's strike waves going on for the Starbucks, the shipping industry and stuff like that. So the US is having unrest also, which is a good sign because there's a lot to be unrested about.
Yeah. If unrested is, that's a good word, Cris. I like that. Anyone else want to respond to this? Good sources of information? Go ahead, Don.
Okay, yeah, this was a comment that somebody made fairly early in the comments, and that was about thousands of people being shot in the back of the head by Russians. And that is directly to the area that I was covering, which was the media. I'm disappointed that after what I said, somebody would basically say, if it shows up on TV, it has to be true. I guess the person didn't listen to what I said. First of all, there were not thousands of people shot in the back of the head. The TV reports that I saw several bodies on the ground, maybe a few dozen. And this is somebody taking something that was on TV and then super exploiting it and making it even more fantastic than it actually was. But in that particular instance, there was no question that there was cameras pointing out people being shot in the back of the head. What there was not was one iota of evidence saying that it was Russians who did that. But there's very good reason to believe that the Russians did not do that, because that occurred in Bucha on April the 6th of this year. What happened was on March the 30th, Russians left Bucha. and because they had occupied it and they saw no strategic reason to keep it. On March the 31st, the very next day, the mayor of Bucha announced the town was liberated. And if bodies were all over the place, you would guess that the mayor would see them and would say something about them. The mayor said absolutely nothing about the bodies, people with their hands shot and they're being shot in the back of the head. The news did not appear until after the Azov Battalion entered Bucha on April the 1st. And the Azov Battalion not only has US training in military, the Azov Battalion has US training in how to make news appear what you want it to appear. It was only after the Azov arrival was that the bodies were found with their hands tied behind their backs and with a bullet in their head. So to say that there's no proof that Russia did this is an understatement by far. And I like to go into these details because when you look at each one of these details of these atrocities committed by Russia, now, I don't think that Putin is any sort of angel, and I don't believe that what he's doing is wonderful. I think that it's understandable given the extreme provocation, but this is something that was clearly made up. And I talked about several things that were made, other things that were made up, and clearly the U.S. has become an expert in manipulating the media to tell people what the ruling class in the US wants them to hear. So I ask that people be a little bit skeptical and not believe that just because I saw it on TV, that's the way it happened. Yeah, there were people shot in the back of their head with their hands tied behind them, but there's zero evidence that had anything to do with Russian troops, and good reason to suggest it did not.
Madelyn?
Yeah, Kim, go ahead. I'm sorry, I had to unmute.
One of the sources that I found really interesting, there's an Australian woman named Caitlin Johnstone, and she has a website, Kaitlin johnstone.com. And she has really done some powerful work looking at the US propaganda system and stuff. I highly recommend that. There's also been stuff in Monthly Review. ZNet's had some stuff. Counterpunch has had some stuff. There's a number of sources that are not mainstream sources that raise a lot of questions. Another one is Covert Action Magazine, which I highly recommend.
In fact, Kim, we just had a post here from Mark Geis. Then it actually, if we can all, everybody can see question and answer. It lists all the countries that either voted against, abstained from, or simply did not vote at all on the UN General Assembly resolution condemning Russia's actions. And that's from an article in Covert Action Magazine from March 24th, 2022. And the title of the article is Russia's invasion of Ukraine signifies the end of an era of unipolar American power. And there's quite a lengthy list here. I'm not going to read it all in the interest of time, but if you could see it in the question and answer section, and that confirms what you just said, Kim. At least part of what you said. You mentioned quite a few other sources besides Covert Action. Here, climate action, you want to say something? That's Bob Grove, correct? See not. I don't see a response. Okay. And then we have here another contribution to this question from Charlene Leahy. I appreciate the outstanding history and analysis by all of tonight's speakers. Please share and support struggling independent journalists who are pushing back against the 24/7 propaganda. I recommend Gray Zone website, Max Blumenthal and Aaron Mate, Consortium News website, Glenn Greenwald, Jimmy Dore has a podcast. Yeah, Jimmy Dore has stepped right into it. And yes, Caitlin Johnstone. And I see a hand up from Ajamu. Maybe this will
Yes.
be a closeout. Yeah.
Yeah, let's close it.
Well, just speaking to the issue of resources, I have to add that if people want to also get another perspective, to remind folks of the Black Agenda report. Some of us have been writing on this situation since 2013. We didn't just discover Ukraine over the last few months. And we provide a fairly unique perspective. Okay. The other place to go is we have the Black Alliance of Peace. We have a Ukraine page that's pretty comprehensive, that lays out a timeline and analysis, but also provides a very, I think, in-depth analysis of the role of NATO. And we believe this is one of the most comprehensive pages out there. So for additional information and a different perspective, remember that there are other folks, non-European folks, who can think and analyze and provide analysis that has value.
Okay, and two more quick comments, because we need to wrap this up. And Edward Nizolowski says there was a good cross-section of opinions on Ukraine in the London Review of Books, March 24th, 2022. And then also, we will be sending out a copy of this webinar to everybody who registered for the event, along with some resources as well. And so if you all could circulate, distribute, publicize the recording from this webinar, that would also help, because there are a lot of really important things said here, and information that you wouldn't necessarily hear anywhere else. So on that note, I want to thank everybody for their participation in this webinar tonight, and everybody who joined us online and who asked a question or made a comment. And is there anything else we need to say?
Let's wrap it up.
All right, then we'll say good night.